at some point in time, the funding that we have is obviously, logistics has always been something that we know has been important. I don't think that's not only because you and I come from a background where logistics has been part of our career. I think by being part of our career, we've understood the importance of it. But there is a perception now that logistics is more important than ever, that we need more supply chain resilience, that, government is working with the economy in different ways to try to create more stability, and that logistics underpins all of that. And somehow in today's world, that logistics is more important than ever. So I guess the question is it more important than ever at this point in time?
I think it's just visibly more important than ever. I think it hit a few things that, like, the consumer hadn't seen how important it was, for instance.
Yeah.
And we mentioned earlier, we were talking about COVID. I mean, COVID put it in front of everyone. Every consumer just became acutely aware of logistics and transportation during COVID and how important it was to them. And that has now created the spotlight. And I think the nice shift is now we've seen that spotlight also come into not consumer logistics. It's come into industrial logistics and the overseas logistics, and people started talking about it, and that's given it space, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other part of that that's interesting is so it allowed the consumer, and I think even government and certain companies to a degree, to recognize that things can go away. We became really used to having things overnight. We became really used to having a disaggregated supply chain where, even as a procurement professional, you could go overseas, you could go to other markets. It was a very slick way of doing business, and you brought more opportunities to grow your supply chain into the world. And then when things started to change during that period of time, certain things all of a sudden didn't show up on the shelf for a short period of time. People finally recognized or saw that it could break. And that was something that they didn't necessarily understand before. But I think the opposite of that as well is that the sector showed that those are very limited things. They have the ability to firefight. They've always been great problem solvers. Where I think the sector could go to strengthen is around bringing in more strategy and thinking through how their relationships with different parts of their supply chain could be strengthened. But the reality was that those blips on the radar at those times made the public aware, and also showed that logistics organizations can overcome those challenges. But it was good that there became I think more knowledge about how logistics actually works, or why it's so important to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I also think that it showed us that we can't just react.
Yeah.
Right. All of those blips, all of those things, as you said, we reacted, the sector reacted, generally solved them. Maybe not as quickly as everybody would have liked.
Yeah.
The blips were longer than people were comfortable with.
Yeah.
But we did react, and the sector is full of really good, as you've put it, firefighters before, but it's really good people that can think through the problems, can find a solution. But often, I think today, those solutions are one-offs.
Yeah.
It doesn't then become that strategic question that you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay, so how? Okay, I solved this problem, now I move on.
Yeah.
But how do I actually now think about that? Hold on, why did I end up with that problem? Why did we have a blip? Why are we now having to shift things like just in time to much longer duration for storage, and we keep more goods so that we can solve that blip? Is that even the right response? Because a lot of the response has been, well, forget just in time, that's over.
Yeah.
Let's do something else. Well, there was a reason just in time came in.
Yeah.
Those reasons still exist. We just have run into issues with it. And that's, I think, to me, the strategic question that's not necessarily being asked by the sector in all circles. I think there are probably corners of it, but I think there's an opportunity to do that now. Another thing that shifted, I think, and I want to get off the COVID thing, but something that happened in COVID that I don't know if it will ever turn around, and I'd be interested to pull some numbers on it. was logistics companies that historically hadn't made a lot of money, that were very low margin, were making a lot of money. And the narrative on some things shifted in that some companies and some, I would say, countries recognized that actually you can make money on transportation. It doesn't have to necessarily be a loss leader to support other industries. And there was, I think, potentially a foundational shift in industry in some companies that were okay to not make money on transportation. Now all of a sudden we're like, okay, it's not just a cost center. This could be a profit center for us. And so that's also, I think, showing in the way things are going. And part of one of the things I want to look into with some of that data to see, has that actually stayed? And now what?
Yeah, because the strategy it looks simplistic, just in time versus just in case. And I think in my time in industry, in the 20 years I was in supply chain, it was much more just in case. There was an evolution into just in time. And in part, that was because transportation might have been expensive. You didn't necessarily, have the same options because we weren't as digitized an economy and there wasn't access to the same level of information. And so you looked geographically closer to build a supply chain just because that was how things basically worked. And with the all the digitization of everything and the ability to connect with companies in all parts of the world in a different way, that obviously then opened up this opportunity to switch to a more just in time. And then the theory behind that was, well, it was cheaper, right? You didn't have to have stuff on the shelf. You're not carrying as much inventory that maybe isn't getting used. And so it allowed you to just cycle faster the things that you needed to, and you had access to it. It wasn't just COVID, but now I think the other thing that in logistics people are talking about more is that there's more regularity of disruption. And so that was the first massive disruption, but then we've seen more. And, we had roads wash out in BC. We've got geopolitical issues at this point in time that are creating different trade and tariff barriers now that are coming into play. And again, those are things we haven't really had with all the free trade agreements that was going away. And now those things are coming back. And so it does make you have to reposition this idea of, well, not everything has to be just in case. There's still items on our shelf that we could do just in time around, but we need to think more deeply now about who are our suppliers, our relationships with them, and whether it's environmental or geopolitical or other things. What I've seen start to change is that geography has become, maybe it's not more important, but it's come back on the table as something that firms have to think about. And I think where I could see an organization like the Alberta Logistics Center of Excellence playing a role is in this idea of getting industry back to the table, or parts of the sector back to the table, to talk about this challenge that they're faced with, and getting them to think strategically, because it's easy, and the act of their business is, hey, what's on tap next? Where are we going to next? What's the next thing we have to deal with? And it's hard to sometimes take that time to step back and go, well, what strategically do we need to think about now? What has shifted in the way that we're operating? And I think that's where we can, provide some support, is to not only provide the data that you're talking about and to give them a sense of how things have shifted, but then also bring them back and give them some resources to say, hey, have you thought about these things in the context of what's happening now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a strong place to play in that. And it's also part of the shift in that, because of the changes, I think, in trade and tariff barriers and the way the world is interacting now, has become in the last year much more competitive.
Yeah.
Like in everything.
Yeah.
The data's there, the information's there. Other countries, we talked about this earlier in the car, other countries are putting a lot of money into industrial development policy and economic development policy, and they're pushing their companies to go global. And all of a sudden we are competing again.
Yeah.
And I think for a long time we weren't competing. right? We had our biggest client to the south, and
Yeah.
they were easy, and we had natural competitive advantages of geography and shared culture and, you know, all these close ties and free trade. And, you know, we didn't have to necessarily compete,
Yeah.
and we could be a bit lazy and still be successful.
Yeah.
And now we're being forced to revisit that, and we're being forced to say, well, no, you have to be competitive.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of ways that other countries are solving for some of our advantages.
Yeah.
You know, and we have to figure that out. We have to help our transportation sector figure that out, and our logistics sector figure that out.
Yeah.
So how do they help our industries be more competitive? And are there ways, for me, one of the things, a huge opportunity for us is, can we help the sector find ways that the sector can actually enable competition
Yeah.
in our other areas? So can the sector become an enabler of other growth?
Yeah.
Because that's where it started, right? If we think about the opening of Canada and the railroads and the highways and the waterways, and why are we able to service the US, it was because from a transportation point of view, we were super competitive.
Yeah.
And that enabled things, and we've sort of lost that.
Yeah.
You know, the investment in the space and the long-term view in the space has lost this idea that transportation and logistics can enable growth in other things.
Yeah, and I think the one of the where some companies can struggle is in understanding, you know, SMEs have a challenge around, they may have a product that's valuable. They have customers and clients. They're in a growth mode. You know, one of the last things that comes is, well, you know, I have a warehouse, but I don't really understand that, you know, there may be even a period of time where I don't have someone who's experienced in, you know, what it takes to run a warehouse. You sort of, you know, learn on the fly. There's a lot of these things that, you know, you can learn as you go. And that's great, except that there does come a time when your competitive advantage comes into play. And part of that is understanding, well, and it may not just be a warehouse person that you need. It may be a specific person with a specific kind of warehouse experience that you need.
Yep.
Sometimes that's the case, and other times it's not the case. And, you know, I think another area that we're really thinking deeply about is how do we support smaller companies to evolve into sort of grow, I guess, their strength and their understanding of what it takes to work with logistics companies as well. And because I think sometimes no different than you know, we've just talked about how procurement folks can utilize digital tools to broaden out their supply chain. I think what happens with a lot of these large freight companies and different transportation companies is you use their portal, you use their website. You don't necessarily understand how to buy freight or how to buy warehouse space or how to evolve what you're doing as an organization unless you have that background or experience. And I think that's another area for us that I think we can support industry to, you know, that's outside of the logistics sector to actually, you know, lean in a little bit differently and understand what it takes to work with logistics organizations so that they get the most out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's since the start of my career, that was always a challenge, right? Is in the transportation space, how do I sell what I do?
Yeah.
Starting off in third-party logistics, but then going into warehousing, into customs brokerage, is you were always struggling with responding to RFPs and RFQs that were difficult to respond to because the person doing the buying and who'd written the RFQ, didn't understand their problem. Not truly. They were told to buy something and they wrote an RFQ to buy that, but they didn't necessarily know why. But then they didn't really understand the market and how that thing that they were buying, in this case transportation or transportation services, actually operated.
Yeah.
And they weren't putting out an RFQ that optimized their results. And we've talked about this before, but especially in the project logistics and the oversized stuff, a lot of my success was in delivering an alternative bid because I would try to figure out what were they actually looking for? What was their real problem they were solving?
Yeah.
And then come up with a solution that matched what the industry could provide. I mean, it's interesting in my current work outside of the center, we do a lot of RFIs. So we go to industry first.
Yeah.
And we say, we are thinking of buying XYZ. here's how we think we're going to buy it.
Yeah.
We want to understand what can you provide that you think would fit this, and how do you recommend we approach you in an RFQ? And then we take all that feedback, and then we do a lot of work to craft an RFQ that will actually get what we need, or what our client needs in most cases, but that the industry can actually deliver it.
Yeah.
So we ask in a way that they understand, that matches what they're able to provide and still gives us what our client needs. And that's something I've very rarely seen in the logistics and transportation space.
Yeah.
Everybody just thinks they know what they want. Oh, I need to buy some trucking. And so they put out an RFQ for trucking. But I mean, I've done crazy things with the way they've written lanes, the way they've described them, the inaccuracies in what they actually need in terms of some of the nitty gritty. Like I'll tell a little story. I mean, we had a client that we had for years and years and years, and we had 2 specific carriers that we worked with to deliver. And it was very weird shipping in that we had multiple stops. It was over 4 provinces. Each stop had its own requirements for setting appointments and when you could deliver. And our carriers that did it had learned all of that, and they had filled in the gaps. And when the client then decided, well, we need to put this out for bid, and they put out a bid, and the first thing I did was call the client and said, this is not what you do. Like, your freight doesn't move like what you're currently trying to buy. And they said, oh, no, this is what we want though. And I said, okay, well, I'm gonna tell you something, and you're not gonna like it. You're asking for things like pricing on detention. I'm like, I did some analysis. You're gonna pay more in detention based on this model you've just put out than you're gonna pay in trucking. And they're like, what? How is that possible? And I ran them through the analysis of how long our trucks were actually sitting because of appointment times. And they went forward with it. And lo and behold, we actually won the competitive RFP. And I sent him his first bill, and it was almost double what we'd been charging them before. And they just about fell off their seat. And I said, this is exactly what I was talking about. I said, the way you went out for this was going to completely disrupt your cost.
Yeah.
But you didn't realize, because we as the provider had never billed you for that, because we had filled in those holes. So we found ways to make it work for us, there was backhaul things, and there was driver time off, and where they were stabling. And it was quite a complicated system, and they had no idea.
Yeah.
And we ended up then renegotiating the whole thing after the competitive RFP, and ended up basically where they were before the competitive RFP. And I think had they gone at that differently, they could have actually optimized, and they could have done a little better.
Right.
But they didn't know what they were buying.
I think that's where, in our early days, I've already seen, I sort of had this perspective that I think we all have seen times when executives and companies who are, obviously incredibly intelligent, know their roles, functionally know how to grow a business, and yet they're not completely in touch with their supply chain and how it truly works. They have people in those roles who are good at what they do. There's a disconnect sometimes because the language isn't completely different, but how things work seems simplistic. It seems like it's straightforward. You put it in a box and we send it somewhere, and it gets opened and the customer loves it, and that's our business, right? Yeah. The reality is very different from that, about how things moved, why we use a certain kind of box, the type of packing material that goes in. We can talk ad nauseum about some of the complexity that adds to the challenge of moving anything. And it doesn't matter what it is. They all have their own rules of the game and things that you really have to understand. And an executive doesn't need to understand all of that. But I think there can be a friction between not having enough influence from the logistics folks and the procurement folks in the C-suite, and the C-suite not completely conceptualizing how their logistics people are working for them or against them, or their logistics supply chain that they're buying or procuring from. And I think we have a really interesting area that we found in our first program, where the CEOs are saying, hey, this is a great program. We really want to adopt technology. We've been talking about this for a while, and we're coming in as a a neutral party to say, we're not going to sell you any technology.
Yep.
We're going to talk about technology in a way where, well, what do you need to know? What questions do you need to ask your technology providers? How do they work together? What kinds of things do you need to think about and understand before you consider this kind of technology? And we start to unpack that scenario before you go and potentially adopt something. And there is this tension of wanting to adopt technologies because it's going to make us more efficient. It's going to improve different things. And we know that it's not that straightforward. And so the centers come forward and said, well, hey, let's take this problem and unpack it a little bit. And the CEOs, and then we are trying to do that as the center in a very respectful and efficient way where we're like, okay, well, we'll put a 2-day session together and, we'll get people in the room. And we even question ourselves about, is that the right amount of time? Can we get through, and so we're really challenging ourselves to put the right program together. And so when we went out to the companies to say, hey, here's what we're offering, my expectation was going to be what you normally see, which is sometimes it's difficult to get people in the room. And in fact, what we've seen is the opposite, in that we've had people come into the room to take this programming that we didn't expect. Bigger companies, medium-sized companies, all over the map, which is fantastic. And then the CEOs and executives are like, can you take my guys for longer? Can you take my people and, dive into this topic more and help them more? And of course we can, but that was, again, that there's an expectation from us that we're trying to be respectful. But I do think that we've found this niche where executive teams are seeing us again as a neutral partner to support. And now we become, because we have executive experience on our staff, and we've all, each of us has an individual skill set where it all overlaps in a way, but, we understand where those overlaps actually are. It does provide or give us the ability to unpack these problems in a really unique way. Mm-hmm. And I think the executive teams are seeing that as a powerful service offering. And then when we get the teams with the expertise and logistics in the room, we're seeing them say, yeah, I never thought about it this way before, or, I need more of this as well, because we're speaking their language. And frankly, none of these groups speak technology.
Yeah.
And that's another gap for us that we're actually filling at this point in time. And so I think those war stories that we've all seen, and then our ability to translate that into some actionable programming is actually in the early stages of us as an organization, proving that we have a lot of different gaps that we're filling.
Yeah, and I think in all of that, we've talked about this a lot of this is available.
Yeah.
Right. And we're trying to fill gaps. Yeah. And I think the one of the biggest gaps we're filling is in cutting through some of the hype.
Right.
And we talked about this in terms of, if you do some research, we've been using LLMs a lot to try and help our thoughts, but to do some of our research. And we talked about it this morning that sometimes the LLMs are just feeding us back the hype.
Yeah.
And they're not actually helping us cut through it, because the public facing stuff that it's looking at is basically all positive.
Yeah.
Right. It's everyone talking about their products. Every technology provider talking about the pros of their product. They don't publicly talk about the cons.
Yeah.
If you get them in a room, you can discuss some of the downsides and how the challenges. But a big part of, I think, what we're doing is taking all of that, putting our contextual experiential lens onto it and saying, well, hold on, there's some hype in here. There are a lot of challenges. Most of this is not easy.
Yeah.
Some of our programs, I hope, are going to make it look easy, but it's not easy. That takes a lot of effort behind the scenes in developing the programs, in thinking through the problems, in the research, and then coming forward with something that I hope will be digestible. And what we're seeing so far in the feedback is that it is. So I think we're so far successful on that. But we had a lot of conversations yesterday at the CITT session that really highlighted, and my table spoke a ton of issues that they have.
Yeah.
In trying to do technology previously, in pilots that they're currently running. I had one participant at the table talk about a program that they've been running for 5 years. It started as a pilot 5 years ago to test some technology. It is still a pilot 5 years later. And my mind went, holy smokes, that's a huge failure. Like, you need to get out of pilot phase.
Yeah.
But their take was, no, this is still all valuable. They're still collecting good data. They just haven't been able to pull the trigger on doing this far and wide. And their comment was, well, we're not giving up.
Yeah.
Which was, for me, was an interesting comment. And somebody else at the table actually pointed out as well, sort of what I was thinking was, well, getting to a fast no is fine, like getting to a no. But this is all part of it, because I heard a lot of objections even to the case study we had. Well, how does it work in Alberta's winter?
Sure.
You know, how is this AI vision? The case study was cameras at a yard and doing gate check-ins for trucks. And it was all based on the AI attached to the cameras is reading the truck information, truck numbers, seals, and everyone at half my table was out of the trucking industry. And they sort of all said, well, that's great. Those are really clean trucks.
Yeah.
That all works. But what if they're coming in during a snowstorm, which is not only is the snow in the camera, but the trucks are covered in road spray. The seals, the back of the truck is caked in snow. So the truck number's not visible. The seal's not visible. The driver, so there's a lot of manual interaction for a lot of, and those are sort of, yes, they're exceptions, but how do you handle them? Because a lot of the benefits to that technology was it took people out of the room. So that's where I think we are going to play and take a very critical lens at times of some of this technology and help these companies with a framework to how do you assess it. And they asked a lot. Everyone at the table was like, well, what, I asked them, what could we do? Where do you need help? I mean, a lot of it was that sort of idea of cutting through the hype. So how do we assess technologies? How do we select then a technology that's right for us? And then, we barely scratch the surface of how do we implement it. But they've all had implementation problems in the past. So, but some of that is they might have selected the wrong technology. So that no matter how perfect your implementation is, if it's the wrong technology, you're going to end up with failures. It's going to be problems. So that's a big part of it. And I think we also really need to talk about the transformation that has to happen to an organization when you move to new technologies. It's not always the case, but from my experience, more often than not, the new technology has to change the way you do business. And if you're not open to that, so if you're just saying, oh, one for one, look, I currently do this service with an old technology. I want to do that exact same service, but I want to put a new technology in. And you try to squeeze a new tech into an old process. That historically doesn't work. And I've seen that both in things I've tried to do and not done well. For clients, we've seen that, where you have to think about, how do I incorporate this new technology in whatever it is and change my process? So how do I optimize my business for this technology? A lot of people look at it the other way around. How do I optimize this technology for my business? And they miss that very interesting strategic area, which is, well, hold on. What can I do differently because of this technology? And if I change some things on my process side, upstream and downstream of that technology, can I optimize for it? And that's an interesting question.
I think one thing that they talked about in the case study element, and you have technology providers who are, they gave us a really balanced story, I think, in the end, in terms of some of the good and some of the bad, or where the challenges are. One thing they talked a lot about communication and change management, which is funny enough, is, you're talking about the adoption of technology, but yet communication and change management are like two other things that obviously impede your ability to do it, and skill sets in that vary widely, not only company to company, but person by person, the ability to accept change and the reason why. And some of what I heard yesterday was even around, we asked the question about, how does a technology decision come about? Where does it come from? What's the rationale? And so I think even giving folks the ability to really ask the questions about, well, what do we want this to do for us? Because sometimes, what I've seen in my past life is I've seen a manufacturing company adopt a a piece of welding robotics or a new heat source or something that works incredibly well. And the sales pitch wasn't just a sales pitch, it actually worked. And so they install this piece of technology into the line, and it's too efficient. So the welding robotics now push stuff through faster. Well, the downstream can't keep up, right? And so now, and I mean, it's probably changed now, but in those times, you see technology that gets donated to a university because, well, it's great, but we can't use it. The other thing that happens is, you talk about coming out of a pilot, but also sometimes you want a change made. You want to evolve the technology in a way. And if you haven't set up the relationship with the vendor and the vendor is selling you something that is a more or less a static product, you can run into issues where you need something slightly different. And you end up with people who are working around the system rather than with the system. And then sometimes the rationale, and I think this is a big challenge, is executives want more information. They want more line of sight. They want more insight into what's going on, which is great. I think technology is potentially a good resource for that. But if that technology makes the staff at all levels work harder, work differently, so that you can get information, that's likely not the best use of their time because you're adding cost to your system rather than making it more efficient so that you have information to take somewhere else. And so I think, again, us in our early days tackling this issue of what questions do you need to ask? Why is this thing important to you? Will hopefully then help that translation of not just adoption, but what we're really talking about, if you analyze how technology works, is there's the adoption of the technology, which is the training, finding the right one, getting it installed and into the process and ready to work. And then that leads to the diffusion of the technology, which is, yes, it's actually working well for us. It's repairable. It is adjustable. We're utilizing it in new ways now that we're doing things differently. I have more time to do X, or we're able to get better insight into Y. And that's when there's a successful use of that technology. And, I don't necessarily have numbers on this, but the question is, how often do executives look at that technology adoption and feel like it's diffused into their system, that people are happily utilizing it and it's making them better? And I hope that number is very high, but based on what we were hearing yesterday, that's probably not the case.
No, I don't think it is. And then the next step in the diffusion process is, how do we get it into industry?
Yeah.
So how do we go from just one company using it to now?
Yeah.
How do we actually show that this is a technology that most companies in the sector should be on? And so that is an area that I think has actually really struggled in the logistics sector. I think we can find, and we won't have to look very hard to find, pockets of some really interesting technology innovations where individual companies they've adopted it, they've diffused it, they're doing extremely well. But then it stops. That's it.
Yeah.
And that's very common, especially in Alberta and Western Canada, where it's one company or two companies are using it, but then the rest of the sector is still on some outdated piece of technology. And that diffusion piece, I think, is really a struggle in this area. And I heard it's interesting on the trucking side again, and at my table had a good number of trucking folks yesterday. And the trucking industry, largely in Canada, and it's changing. And I want some more data, and we can talk about that, is how hard it is to get some of this data. But there's a program called AS400. It's an old transportation management system. It's DOS based. There's some ways that you can use a mouse, but most of it is like function key shortcuts and tabbing. And it is amazing. It's like the backbone of Canadian trucking. And the majority of stories I've heard of companies getting off of it have been close to unmitigated failures, have almost, and I think there are some cases where that transition has actually broken a company, in that it renders them unable in a lot of cases to bill their clients. It renders them unable to track cargo, not because the new technology that they're getting onto is amazing, but the problem is this transition space. And how do you connect, especially physical hardware that's able to interface with a DOS system?
Right.
That hardware can't talk to now a cloud-based system. And I used to talk when I was with you at the GOA and doing this for the Alberta government. I talked to a lot of technology providers about, they had these great systems. Oh my goodness, look, we can do all this digital stuff. We can do fully SaaS-based transportation management systems. They can have all this technology. And I would always say to them, well, can you connect to DOS-based hardware? Can you connect to warehouse guns that are wired with the old style connections? And they would go, no, why? Who's using that? I said, well, most of these companies are on AS400. It's DOS. I was like, how long has Windows been around?
Yeah.
No one's been able to convince these companies to go from DOS to Windows.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a really interesting problem in this space.
So, that the added complexity, of course, now as well with AI, and that was some of what the discussion I heard yesterday as well was. So I was surrounded by some folks in the ports, and then some really large companies who move a lot of product, use a lot of big technology, and that was their comment was around interoperability. And that ability to connect their suppliers, their supply chains together. And then, even someone raised the question of how does my AI talk to your AI, or do they talk to each other? And to your point, then they got onto this topic because a lot of these sectors or subsectors are highly regulated. And there isn't necessary, the data is there in government in different pockets, in industry in different ways, maybe still in a DOS-based system, but nobody seems to be able to aggregate this in a way that's usable by industry. Maybe they don't want to. There was a discussion how in the US this does happen. It is something that you can gain better access to, whether it works as well as it, is perceived or not, who knows. But, this is an interesting, it's interesting because these are the industry challenges that we're hearing around technology. The data isn't all theirs. They do need, because of the way these systems work, to interact both human to human, but then system to system. And I think, like you say, the technology providers do a great job on the technology, but they don't always speak when different technologies are interacting together. And that can be expensive and challenging and maybe doesn't work. So leading to some potential failures. And, for us as an organization, we are funded to support companies to adopt technology, to execute on strategy. And those are very high level words. And, we can get into the specifics around what that means, but it's not necessarily up to us to own those bigger challenges or the industrial policy issues that surround that. But I think, have a lot to add. And our focus isn't just on delivering the programs. It's also about how do we better connect these organizations together, both companies on one side of the equation, but there are some long-standing industry associations and organizations who are all segmented in their own ways into what they do, and they do a good job. And what we see one of our roles as being is coming into this system and being a partner, right? We're not coming into the system to say, oh, hey, we have all the answers. We're going to put on all the programs. We have all of the solutions. What we're saying is we've got strong industry players who have needs. We have industry associations who have the ability and the connections and, long-standing relationships and programs to deliver. And now we have this ability to come in and go, we are in a time. And you can argue that we're always in a time where we as a country need to up our game, but we really are in this, one of these pivotal moments historically. And we can choose to all stay in our lane. We can choose to do all of the things that we've always done and live in these older systems. Will we get left behind? Time will tell. But the reality is what we also heard yesterday from industry was, well, if you're not moving forward, you're moving backwards. And so we recognize the need to lean in and to adopt technologies where we want to add a lens, another strategic lens. We keep coming back to strategy. And it's not because companies don't use strategy. It's not because there aren't strategic individuals within organizations who do a good job. It's that this is a sector that moves. It's a sector that connects constantly, and it can be hard to take the step back and reset. And I do think in lots of ways, companies are individually having to do that. Industry associations are having to do that. And I think where we've seen a lot of early success is that this really a supply chain attitude of how can we do this better? Where are the gaps versus rushing in? You mentioned earlier about we know programs exist. Well, sure, we could hire someone today to put on an AI program. The question is, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about LLMs? Are we talking about other versions of technology? And what is the change management associated with that? If we just rushed in and said, this is how you use ChatGPT for logistics, well, you can already probably go online and get that. We are not adding any value to that conversation.
Yep.
And I think that's our goal as an organization, is to say, we are going to bring a different lens to everything we do. We are going to partner and build relationships, and not to say that's not being done, but that we are a new force to be reckoned with, and that we want to really bring these questions into the light. And if we are going to be successful in whatever the future of Canada looks like, and we hear a lot about defense, we hear a lot about critical materials, those to me are big size of the pie conversations, to use your words, where logistics companies don't necessarily control that market. They move stuff when there's stuff to be moved. Well, if there's nothing new to be moved, they're kind of locked in, and we come in with our great programming that helps them just compete better with each other.
Yep.
That's not really a service to industry. So why we have to elevate our lens and our strategic vision and talk about industrial policy and these other things, do we own that? No, we don't. But if we can't increase the size of the pie, and if worst case scenario happens, and in fact, some of our sectors start to shrink that we've traditionally relied on, the companies within logistics are going to shrink along with that because they don't have the ability to control that. So, we're kind of taking a bigger lens to what we do and why, and it plays into technology and it plays into these things, in a really different way. And we do have to balance that out because we have our mandate and what we do. But at the same time, we have to our feeling is we have to push that envelope and start these conversations that are started, or join in or add value to these conversations that are happening, and, make sure the perspective of logistics companies actually get heard.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, as you said, we've been talking about strategy a lot, and you just touched on a whole bunch of things, but I want to pull out of there. Strategy is hard.
Yeah.
There's a reason most companies get it wrong. And it's not because the leaders aren't highly competent. It's not because they don't know their space. It's not because they have bad systems. They're, very good companies, very strong strategic leaders get strategy wrong.
Yeah.
Because strategy is hard. You need time and space to do strategy. It's not planning. It's not operations. Yeah. You have to think long term. Strategy has to be over a long term vision. You can't think strategy in 6 months.
Yeah.
Strategy needs to be a multi-year effort. It needs to be at the ecosystem level. So when we talk strategy, we have the time and the space right now because we've been fun to do it, to think long-term, to think ecosystem. But the industry doesn't have that luxury most days. And we talked about the firefighting earlier, and that is never going to change, I don't think. For companies and leaders that are in the sector, they have to be in the trenches. Things are always changing for them. And it's hard for them to get out of it on their own and think strategy. But I think what we saw with intelligent warehousing and the response was, hey, you guys forced us to think about strategy. And now that we did,
Yeah.
we really like this and we need to do more of it. And we need to be that enabler and that pull.
Yeah.
Because industry's not going to push us to do strategy.
Yeah.
We have to pull industry to do strategy. And we're going to have to pull, I hate to say it, but some of our funders too. We have to pull them also into strategy because they also get pushed by industry into tactical.
Yeah.
Right. And into thinking about very specific regulations. And, we can very easily have conversations with any one of our industry players and most of our funders on like a specific regulation or a specific policy.
Yeah.
And they can talk about that at length and why that affects their company and, what it's doing to them. But very few of them will actually then think the policy above that. So how do we have a strategy for these policies that then helps guide the conversation about an individual's policy that aligns with a strategy? So we have to play that, and we have to be that party that pulls everybody to the strategy table and says, look, you got to get out of the trenches.
Yeah.
We don't need you to do it forever. This isn't, we want everyone to never be in the trenches. All the CEOs, you never get in the trenches. You have to be in the trenches.
Yeah.
And you will be. We want to pull you out of that for a little while. We want to set a table, give a framework, guide the discussion so that while you're out of the trenches, you're hyper-focused and we lead you through that strategy. That's a real, I think, a place for us to play.
I talked yesterday in the session about a system I used when I was in industry. It's called 4 Disciplines of Execution. And I worked in an organization that loved change. And the CEO was just like, and it was mostly a good thing. Like we did lean and we did a lot of things that improved the situation. It did lead to some change fatigue and some challenges because it was like you get better and then the CEO was like, yeah, now let's get even better. Right. And everyone's like, oh man, okay, here we go again. And so I loved the ethos and it did lead to a strong change culture, but it doesn't stop change fatigue. And I sat in a session and learned about 4 disciplines, and I won't go into the details of it, but what I loved about it was it's a system where you have to ask yourself questions before you make a change. And number 1, it says, if you try to change 1 to 3 things, you'll likely be successful in changing 1 to 3 things. If you try to change 3 to 6 things, you'll likely be successful in changing 1 to 3 things. And if you try to change more than 6 things, you're probably not going to be successful in changing anything. And then the next question you have to ask yourself is, in the 1 to 3 changes that I want to make, how much better am I going to get? So in other words, you're forced to then, with that question, say, well, where am I today? Right? And so coming back to this idea of using strategy and executing on it is the next. That's why strategy, if it's written down, that's great. But then are you executing on it? But part of it is to say, when we make this kind of change, do we ask ourselves how much better? So for the Center of Excellence, what I've said is, if we can get industry to be 10% more strategic, I think that would be a win. Now, how to measure that's a really difficult thing, but it sets a number, because what if you don't set a number? What I learned about managing change was people will and even the CEO will naturally think we're going to get 100% better, which is never going to happen in any kind of change. And you're only thinking that because you didn't set a number. You're like, well, we're already 50% as good as we need to be. So the same thing here. It's like, we're not saying, hey, industry doesn't use strategy. Some use it well and some don't. And some have time and some don't. And what we're really saying is, well, hey, wherever the number is today, and let's just say that 25% of companies use strategy really well, just as an arbitrary number. Well, if we could help 10% more use it, or help to increase that number to 35%, then that's something that we can do within the system. And then again, within 4 disciplines, because it makes you walk through the process, now you have to set a scorecard. Now you have to talk about, leads and lags, and how are we actually going to achieve that? And that's also what can fall out of the equation with strategy is, we might think 10 years ahead, 5 years ahead, whatever it is that's realistic. We set this really strong plan for what we think we need to do. now you have to action it. Well, what are the tools to action it? And, and so for me, that's where, again, I think we can play a really significant role, maybe not for everybody, because not everyone's going to be drawn into that conversation. But, I liked your example when we sort of deployed this and now we're getting, hey, we want more. One of the things I've talked about is sometimes in these programs, it's an exercise in drinking really shitty coffee for 2 days or 1 day or whatever it is, versus, getting to the end of a program and having it reflected like, hey, we want more of this. That was probably one of my favorite things that I've heard talked about in our very, very early days here, because we're like, oh, okay. So we are on, at least in terms of where we are today, started to put some of those wheels in motion. And the feedback has been, even yesterday with our sessions where we're talking about AI, people were excited about the conversation, very engaged, telling us their challenges, and, open to this idea that we are going to play a role for them moving forward. And so obviously we're excited about that. I think that kind of leads a little bit as well to another area that we've thought about, which is Executive Exchange, which is a program, that was what we launched yesterday in a way, or it was the first session of Executive Exchange is what we launched yesterday. And that is about bringing these folks to the table. And it's not just about networking. It's really about digging into what challenges actually exist and then figuring out what role we can play to support that forward movement.
Mm-hmm. And something I just thought of while you were talking about all of that and tying it back to some of our other stuff is we have talked about, and I'm pretty sure you're the one who first said it, was strategy as a team sport. Yeah. And I've always, well, not always, but for a long time, I've recognized that business is a team sport. And that's also one of the things I think we did a little bit better with intelligent warehousing with the first program was most of our attendees were multiple people from a company.
Yeah.
And actually, it just clued and keyed on me that yesterday we didn't have that.
That's true. Yeah.
We had one person from every company.
Yeah.
And I think we need to also help. And it also resonates with a couple of the comments I heard. And I challenged a couple of the folks at the table was, so who's in charge of AI at your company? Well, it was either I am or technology, not just AI. Well, it's I am, and they were the CEO or the VP.
Sure.
But then the ones that it wasn't the CEO sitting at the table, they said, well, our CEO is looking into it.
Yeah.
Anyone else at your company looking into it? No, just the CEO.
Yeah.
Probably not a great framework to say, well, one person is looking, whether it's the CEO or someone else. One of the things I think we need to keep pushing is that these things are a team sport.
Yeah.
And even at our executive exchanges, I think we maybe should encourage that you bring two people to these.
Yeah.
And recognize right from the beginning, this is a team sport. So you need to come as a team.
Yeah, I think so one of the things I like about the Center of Excellence and how we've tried to approach, it's a couple things. So yesterday, not only, did we model bringing folks together but we're modeling the use of the technology. So yesterday we sat 8 individual tables. We had people that take notes, which is very typical. We've all seen it in flip charts and different things. So we did have that, and there was a lead at each table that was drawing conversations out. But we used an AI technology to transcribe the conversation. And then we realized, well, okay, legally we can, record people in the room and, whatever, but obviously you want to have a policy about, well, what does that mean? What are we informing them about? What are we going to use the information for? And then we designed an AI policy, which we then shared with everybody in the session to say, well, hey, we're going to record this unless anybody has a real issue, which surprisingly, no one had an issue with the recording of, and we weren't talking necessarily about trade secrets in any way, but people were openly sharing. But we set the standard for, well, this is how we're going to use the information, and it's going to be anonymized, and all of those things are going to be controlled. And I think we do that as well within how we approach strategy, because we do bring our team together to talk about it. We challenge ourselves with coming up with solutions. But, one thing that I really like about what you've brought to the table for the team is we have these great conversations about a program or about, something that needs to happen. And it's the royal we. And, the thing you've been questioning the team on was who's going to lead that. And it seems like a simple question, but the functionality of that from a team is like, and that person is the lead, but that doesn't mean they're going to do all the work. And I think that's why you get into this general conversation of the CEO wants to do X and you bring a team to do whatever. But that reality of taking the step to say, I'm going to lead this. This is my team that I'm working with. And then that's the person that kind of owns directionally how this thing's going to move forward. It's amazing how that seems like such a simple thing, and yet how often those types of things actually get left behind or not thought about.
Yeah, it's so simple to overlook, right?
Yeah.
That someone has to own.
Yeah.
And move forward. And we got in that trap in a couple of cases.
Yeah.
Where we had great conversations, we came with great ideas, and everybody's like, that's a great idea. And then we left the meeting.
Yeah.
Well, hold on. None of us actually ran with the idea. And then we came back a week later and it's like, did anybody do anything on that? No.
Yeah. I think it speaks to that percentage thing, right? Like, even if even if you're doing it well, where are the things that, and it could be a little thing like asking a question or assigning somebody to it. But I think, again, that neutral, we are not selling memberships to industry. We're not taking huge dollars to run a program. It's not how we are funded to do the work that we're doing. We are funded to deliver results. We have KPIs about, training, increased revenue. There's a lot of nuts and bolts in terms of structurally the things we have to achieve. And it's more about how to help industry drive what they're doing, achieve the goals that they've set for themselves. We are not telling them what that is. We're here to support them. And I think even for us, the strongest teams will always have things that they can do differently or better, where their resources can be analyzed in a way that will help them to functionally improve what it is they're actually doing. And so, I think that's a huge value add that we even recognize and flip on ourselves to say, yeah, you know what, we're not quite where we need to be. This is the step that we need to take, and bringing in those out. We've even brought in outside resources to help us walk through our strategy to make sure that we have that third party or the sober set of eyes on what we're doing and functionally allowing us to participate in the conversation versus having to control the meeting where we're talking strategically about what's going on. So that's, another area that I think we have a strength in that we can lend to industry as well. And we're funded to do that.
Yeah. And I really enjoy the fact that we can have these conversations. We can look at these things and try to come up with best practice for us. And then we're turning it outward.
Yeah.
Like that to me, I really enjoy that because I've been in those conversations and then it's in that vacuum of that entity or that business unit.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, that's great. We did a great thing, but we don't share it.
Yeah.
Right. For competitive reasons, you're a competitive company and you're not going to share your secret sauce.
Yeah.
But for us, that's exactly, we're creating the secret sauce so that we can use it, but then so that we can share it.
Yeah.
Right. And we did that with the AI governance or AI policy that we're putting out. That we're sharing. We also, we haven't done it yet, but we were talking about with Stampede coming up. And one of our colleagues, Pete, was, he had this whole framework he was putting together of how do you decide which events you should attend? Then once you've decided that you're going to attend an event, how do you decide who in the company attends that event?
Yeah.
Then you look at, okay, the reasons we attended it was so that we could get X, Y, and Z out of it or accomplish something. And so how do we make sure and measure that the person who attends hits those things and does it. And he had this whole thought process and it was fantastic. And one of the things I've been talking about, is all of our companies are going to be attending Stampede. They're all facing this. And I have never, in all the times I've attended Stampede or Global Petroleum Show or the various other conferences, gone into it with that sort of a mindset.
Yeah.
And I really liked it. And that's another one where I'm like, okay, let's write this.
Yeah.
And then let's publish it.
Yeah.
let's give it to our sector so that we're doing that at that conference, but then all of our sector players are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden they're going to get better at going to these things. They're going to get more out of it. So that's, I really enjoy that, like create it and share it.
Yeah.
So that we're also a team sport, right?
I think that, that sort of leads probably to the area that we haven't really touched on, that we also have some programming around, which is, this idea of growth. So whether it's growth in terms of learning something new, adopting it, and it doesn't matter where you are in your career, there's always something new to learn. There's a perspective to be gleaned. And, you can argue whether everybody's open to that or not, but I think we all sort of seek this, or we have this desire to improve in terms of what we're doing. And, growth is ultimately the key. I think that one of the areas, if we move from the strategy domain space where, we specifically haven't got into what we're doing there. And I think the first program to me that I see kind of leans into this idea of bringing business owners into a conversation about strategy and about growth. And it's the idea of supporting trucking companies. You talk about the hollow middle. And so we tend to have companies, under 40 trucks. And then we have companies who are hundreds of trucks. And there's kind of a gap there. And it's not necessarily something that the Center of Excellence is going to help companies to grow into this gap. We might help to fill that middle, but it's really about the idea that smaller companies struggle sometimes with similar things. I think we've learned on the technology front in our early programs that big and small companies were at scale. The scale was different, but the challenges were the same. I think what's different about talking about small trucking companies looking to grow is that you have an entrepreneur, obviously likely has a skill set of being a driver, starts a company because he or she sees an opportunity. And then it's this idea of, scaling beyond where you actually are. And I think that was something that, you had brought early on, was this idea of how do we support these small transportation companies, trucking companies to actually grow, because we do have this hollow middle. And, the need for companies to be able to scale is limited across domain spaces. It's not just a transportation problem, but how do we bring a transportation focused program to support companies to grow in that space? I think that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to that going live. We've been talking about it, so it's not like it's a secret or anything. But yeah, this what we currently call the Operator to CEO program it started at the company, at the small company. That's where the idea came from, was just looking at small companies and how do we grow them. And it has since expanded to the ecosystem, because I started questioning, okay, there obviously was, from talking to small companies and talking to our industry partners like AMTA, there was a need for this. So that was pretty obvious right away, that small trucking companies struggle to grow and then be successful. And there's this like churn that they get to, say, 7 to 10 trucks. And the industry has kind of told me that's a sort of a tipping point. So you get to 7 to 10 trucks, and then you either get fed up and you're not making money and you're struggling, and so you then shrink back down to 1, 2, 3 trucks, or you try to grow and you get to 15 or 20 trucks, let's say, and then you fail outright and you get back down to 1 truck, or the owner might end up then driving for somebody else again. And very few then get beyond that and actually now are running a successful, at this point still by, I think, national terms, a small company.
Yeah.
But in the trucking space now, you're a medium-sized trucking company. And so that was fairly obvious, as I say. But then I started to think about it bigger, to start to question, well, should we as the Center of Excellence play in this space, and why? And it came back to, I started to look at, like, what's the health of the sector? And what would a healthy sector look like? And so I started to put that strategic long-term lens on, and that was where I started to come up with this idea and identify the hollow middle. Okay, well, why does that matter? So why is a hollow middle a problem? And the reason that I saw that as a problem, and the reason I'm hoping we can start to solve that, is the middle is where we see a lot of innovation happen. It's these medium-sized companies that are on these steep trajectories of growth that are innovating quickly. They're innovating in ways that I think also do a lot more of that technology diffusion piece of they bring in innovation that the sector then looks at, and you have other companies take that innovation on. And it's interesting, and I'm not an expert on this, but I did a fair amount of reading. The companies at the top continue to innovate, and they continue to innovate quickly, and they put a lot of money in. So that, you're talking your big companies, your multinationals, your 1,000 employee plus, but they're innovating typically internally. So they're doing process innovation. They're getting better at what they do. They're, cutting costs or increasing their market share through innovation by 1% or 2%. Very good innovation, but not sector innovation largely. Sometimes you'll see it. And so when we talk about the strategy in our ecosystem and how do we make the sector stronger, I saw that in the trucking space as a real weakness, because even if we can identify some innovations, the middle where that is going to happen, where it's the most likely to succeed, doesn't exist. So if I go out in the sector and say, hey, I got a great idea for innovation in the trucking sector, I need some companies that are willing to pilot it and allow it to be public, because that's also part of what we want to drive, right? We don't want to just go in and help one company innovate and then we don't talk about it. We want to be able to talk about it. We needed those middle companies, and I was like, I don't see a lot of those.
Yeah.
I can find one or two. That's, and they'll probably, in fact, I'm certain that the ones that are domiciled in Alberta would be all over it and they would be interested. There's just not very many of them. And so that was that strategic lens of the whole thing. And so we're starting with operator CEO with small companies. And we're going to launch it hopefully second week of July, so right after Stampede. So after we give everybody this amazing framework to go to Stampede and come back, then we'll throw a program at them. But a lot of the interesting conversations we've had around the idea of operator to CEO has actually been quite a few folks saying, well, can we go smaller? What if it's companies that are 1 truck or 2 trucks? And then a lot of them saying, well, what about the companies that are 20 trucks or 30 trucks? Mm-hmm. Because there are some out there, and how do we do that? So there's been this it's interesting, this interest in the program we're delivering, but then everybody has looked at it and also it's spurred the discussion of, well, where else can we apply that? Because we like that concept.
Yeah.
So how do we do that in other ways? And you even had a conversation with not a trucking company that liked that idea and said, well, hold on, can we do this for this group?
Yeah.
Yeah, we probably could. It's an interesting idea, but we're gonna launch this one as a pilot, and then hopefully it will be successful. Yeah. I'm pretty confident it'll be successful, but things can fail. But my hope is that A, the pilot's successful, B, we can learn a lot through it, bring some interesting folks in, tweak it, polish it, and then we want to run it. Say every 3 months, we want to run a cohort of it. And then from there, grow it. And then say, okay, now that we've got this thing, it works really well, we have a good concept. How do we now apply it to some other areas?
I think the other thing that sometimes happens with organizations that deliver programs is that the program doesn't necessarily evolve through lots of different reasons. And maybe they don't all need to evolve. But I think when you're getting into programs that really speak to the folks who, that they're for, is they ask for what's next. Or, you learn something that, someone comes and asks you a question from that cohort or gives you some feedback, and you evolve the program based on, the information that you have at hand. And I think that for us, nothing will ever be static. And so, we bring a lot of resources together to design the program and talk to a lot of individuals. That's what the session yesterday was all about. Really try to go into it with a really strong sense. And then, either something evolves in the program that we're delivering, or in the case of Intelligent Warehouse, it was, hey, this is great. Can you now help me to go to this level or to solve this problem, or, whatever that is. And that, I think, is really something that as an organization, we're very good at, because we're open to those collaborations and the change that is required to meet the demand of the sector. And that's really, not to say that other organizations aren't doing that. But again, our mandate and our funding and what we're trying to achieve is perfectly aligned with this idea of delivering the exact right product, of finding the gap, and making sure that we're delivering, occasionally for an individual organization if there is a rationale to do that. But generally we're looking at, it from a broader lens, and what we're putting together is, to help. So in the case of this, I think what we're learning is we come into it with a sense of what we think is the right thing. You've done the analysis, had the conversations, we've all been having them. And now well, maybe there is something for an organization that doesn't look like a trucking company, but they buy a lot of trucking services, and here are their challenges, right? And It isn't necessarily them coming into the program, but it's an idea that, there's a specific type of trucking company that, and so, we are really proactively trying to learn and engage and then figure out how to deliver the program in the best way possible, and then learn from that and kind of move forward. And, I think, again, that's a very industry way of approaching these things. And it's something that, we kind of have in our DNA, which I think is a really positive thing to moving forward.
Yeah. And I think that DNA comes from your selection of the people who are involved at this stage, and what we've talked about, and the encouragement, not just in our strategy sessions, but in we do our weekly ducks in a row meeting, and we do our weekly programs meeting. And we have created, or you've created, I think, a space where all of us challenge everything.
Yeah.
And we said it yesterday, I think, we'll probably get the quote wrong, but the most dangerous saying is that we do it this way because we've always done it this way.
Yeah.
And I think we have really embraced that is dangerous.
Yeah.
And that when we have these meetings and we look at these ideas, we question them, we challenge them, we go back and test them again.
Yeah.
And we've gotten into a cadence now of, we look at ideas, we talk to industry, and they give us things. We don't immediately then take that and say, okay, here's a program because we can meet some KPIs. We test it. So we say, okay, we have an idea. What could a program look like? What's a concept of a program? And we take that concept back out to industry, and we have a whole bunch of conversations, and we validate the concept. And if the concept rings, we take the feedback, and now we actually develop a program around it. And we still continue to iterate and talk to industry. And we're doing that with Operator to CEO. Our next phase, we are going to do some what we call rapid industry discoveries, which is we're going to go back out again. And we've done now, this is probably, I think, our third iteration of going back to industry and saying, okay, here's what we've put together in a whole bunch of details. We now have, we have session structure. We have what we think are going to be the outcomes of each session. We've talked about some of our templates of material that we're going to provide. And now we're taking that out, and we're going to do some rapid discovery interviews to test all that before we actually launch.
Yeah.
And that process of challenging it every time, of every step, and never saying, okay, now that we've accepted that we're going to do this program, let's just deliver it.
Yeah.
We constantly are challenging it. And after we deliver the pilot, we're going to challenge it again. And it's not just how do we make this better, but we are going to ask the question, did this work?
Yeah.
So should we continue?
Yeah.
And I don't think that we will be afraid to say, if it doesn't work, that we won't run it again.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I think if we have value, so there's a couple of things for me. Number one, when we started looking at how to structure a center of excellence, we talked a lot about strategy, which we've talked a lot about today. And then I think for us, yes, strategy is important. We're going to have lots of supports around that. But actually, decision quality is also really important. And it's hard to get. It takes a lot of work. Like you reflected something the other day that said, we make this look easy because we're getting traction, we're hearing great things, and it can look easy from the outside looking in, and it's really not. It's no different than we started off initially talking about change management and communication. Those are not easy things to do well. And so, sure, it's easy for us to sit and say, yeah, if you're going to do technology adoption well, you need to be good communicators and you need to have change management. And often that's where it gets
It's
left,
tough. Yep.
right? And so then to model, and that's where I keep coming back to this idea of us as an organization to model, we will be the first ones to say if we did something that didn't work the way that we thought it would be. I like people challenging the process, because if you don't have a process where communication is so free flowing that people feel comfortable to share, you're likely not going to achieve the goal that you want to achieve. And that seems like a simple thing to say, but how often have you worked in an organization where someone's a little titchy, or you don't necessarily want to bring up the elephant in the room or whatever it is? And when you have that foundationally in the structure, and then you're trying to be successful and you're trying to make change. And so, again, it has to come back to, it can be painful to get negative feedback. It can be difficult to learn that what you thought was the right thing to do isn't the right thing to do. But if you then unpack that and say, well, yeah, okay, this program, I don't know that I'd ever call anything a failure, because you can learn from everything and then you use it in a positive sense. But yeah, we're not going to do this anymore. But it was based off of this huge amount of work that got put into, well, was this the right thing to do in the first place? And if you go through all of that and you're going back and you're testing with your customer 3 times and you're doing this, and then it doesn't work out exactly the way that you thought it was going to, what else do you want from people? Like, what else as an organization can you ask for? It goes back to, I'm doing this because I'm going to get 100% better. Well, even through that process of learning. And so again, if we can do things to improve decision quality, and I keep saying helping someone to say no in industry fast is equally as valuable, if not more, than helping them to say yes to something. Mm-hmm. And if we can provide then the foundation to say, well, here's a policy that will work for you, adapt it, do with it what you will around AI or governance or whatever it is, or here's how we tried this really big thing as an organization, and you could be adopt technology, run a strategy, whatever it is. And we're like, hey, we ran this program. We did communication really well to the best of our ability. We did test it with our, and here's what we found out. And, here's what we'll do better next time. But hey, sector, learn from our mistakes, because that, again, is what we're funded to do. I don't think there's much more, there's a lot more that we can do and offer. But in terms of a value, I do think that there's a ton of value in that. And I also think that shouldn't be unique, but it is.
Yeah.
And so if we're going to be unique, and then we're going to share what that actually looks like and feels like, and the good and the bad around that, I think that that is unusual enough that people will want to understand what we're doing. They already do. That they'll want to model based off of what we're doing, that they will be attracted to our programs, which they are. And so we are seeing the fruits of that build up. But 6 months ago, when we sat in a room and talked about what we thought would be the right thing to do, and then had to deal with the discomfort of the executives that we were working for, them not necessarily understanding the vision as much as we tried to explain it. And, and generally speaking, that is what you have to manage. And, that doesn't get talked about very often. Mm-hmm. And that uncertainty level of adopting or developing a strategy or doing whatever, it's all the same. The work's different. What you're doing is different. But the underneath, the people aspect, and that was actually, I think, one of my biggest takeaways yesterday, was how often we just came back to people. Mm-hmm. And how often, in what you hear in media, what you hear outside, is all about technology. And this is going to replace that. And this is going to, except. And, those exceptions get ignored or misunderstood or undervalued. And it's the exceptions where the success is either it lies or it doesn't. And, we're neck deep in all of these things, and, have a pretty open door and transparent policy. And that comes at a cost, and it's not easy. and it is painful, and that can lead to misunderstandings as hard as you try to not. But I would argue also that the fact that we're, now 8 weeks old and have a huge amount of not only positive feedback, but actual program experience that has led to more, that we have companies we never even thought would be interested in what we're doing coming to find out what we're doing. It shows that all of that does pay off. And, that doesn't mean we're perfect by any means. We've got a long ways to go, but, we've done things to the best of our ability. And I think that has a lot of value. So.
A ton of value. And that, I mean, your point of it's decisions and it's people.
Yeah.
All of it is. Right. And I think arguably we've made some good decisions, and we made those good decisions because we went into it with some good decision-making processes.
Yeah.
I mean, you taught decision quality. It was a really fun event to come and help you with that course and to put a logistics lens into it. And it's something that I've been talking about in the consulting world and with all the folks that are on my team. Is I ask the silly question of so what a lot, but the so what is, what decision is our client trying to make, and how is what you're doing going to help them make that decision?
Yeah.
And a lot of that was always coming into, well, how is the client making that decision? You're coming up with great information that's really interesting, and the client doesn't have a decision model that's going to fit into.
Yeah.
And so first we have to think about the decision model and then think about what are the good inputs into it. And I think we have done a really interesting few first steps of having first discussions of a decision model.
Yeah.
Right before we even get into decisions. And we come back to this a lot of times, even when we have a new idea.
Yeah.
And we start talking about the idea and going down, and we catch ourselves and bring ourselves back to, well, hold on. How are we making this decision? And then let's talk about some of these details and why do those details matter? And I think that's a big piece of what we can give to industry, is a lot of that decision model framework. And because a lot of what, I go back to what they were asking was, how do we decide on a technology? How do we analyze these technologies? How do we decide how to implement? Each of those are decisions.
Yeah.
And as you said, each of those have people behind it.
Yeah.
And a lot of places where, this nebulous change management or communication falls down is that the individuals that we're trying to influence have a decision model that we don't understand. And so we think we're giving them the right thing, but in reality, their decision model has no place for what we just provided.
Yeah.
And so it all comes down to an individual operator deciding, will they click the button the way that we wanted them to click the button, or will they find a workaround? Will they use the technology that we think they're going to use, or the way that we think they're going to use it, or will they do something else? Or do they not even ever make that decision? And we think they do, but it just happens. And that's a big piece of it. And that's where, I think we have done a good job of that to start. Like you say, we have a long way to go, and we keep challenging ourselves and developing these decision models with each new idea that comes into it. You kind of, a certain idea will break the decision model. You go, oh crap. Well, we need to come up with a new way to look at this because that doesn't work anymore. But now that builds to the overall model. And we have to keep doing it, and we have to keep sharing it and pushing it out. Yeah, it's an interesting topic.